Welcome back to Inside City Hall. Joe Biden has picked his running mate, and now the race for president enters a new phase. But many questions remain here in New York over our voting process in November. We've got a pandemic, and we've got a president, Donald Trump, casting doubts on the integrity of the voting system. After widespread complaints about the process during New York's June primaries, state lawmakers held a hearing earlier today to see what needs to be improved to make it through the fall. The state senator who chaired that meeting is joining us now. Zellnor Myrie represents a district in Brooklyn, and he serves as chair of the state Senate's Elections Committee. Welcome, Senator. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be with you, Errol.
I know it was a long day and a long hearing, so I will keep this real simple. What were you able to find out about the most serious problem that we need to deal with to be ready for November? There were a lot of things that went wrong in June. We don't necessarily want to live in the past. But what was the thing that you think went most wrong, and how do we fix it?
I think one of the biggest concerns that we have, and what came across from all of the testimony that we heard, were serious lapses in the communication between the Board of Elections and the United States Postal Service. We saw that miscommunication led to Brooklyn being disproportionately impacted by disenfranchisement. We had the other boroughs where no postmarked ballots were under 80 total, and in Brooklyn that number was close to 5,000. The total 84,000 ballots were not counted for one reason or another. And I believe that it is incumbent on the United States Postal Service and the boards of elections to be working in sync in order to deliver democracy in November.
Is the problem when it comes to the postmark, is the problem that they weren't postmarked and therefore the Board of Elections couldn't be sure that they were delivered in time, or was the problem that they were just delivered too late?
Well, it was a little bit of both, Errol. Part of it was they were not postmarked, and the lack of postmarking was due to both human and mechanical errors in the Brooklyn post offices and to some extent in the Manhattan main office. But the Board of Elections was also under immense pressure because the majority of the applications for absentee ballots came in within a week of the deadline. And so you saw 54% of these applications, upwards of 30,000 applications come in right by the deadline, and you got situations where the post office was not receiving the bulk of the ballots until the day before the election.
I ended up asking for an absentee ballot, and it came in time, and I could have used it. But in the end, I chose the early voting option. There was almost no line when I went over to the Brooklyn Museum, and I'm very glad that I did that. Would you be comfortable telling most New York voters that early voting or other means of voting in person would be preferable to voting by mail in November?
I think anyone who is physically able, anyone who doesn't fear that their health will be compromised, should take advantage of early voting. To be fair, there were immense circumstances for the Board of Elections and the post office. They had never dealt with mail-in voting at this volume with such a compressed timeline. So we can be empathetic to why there were mistakes. But the stakes are way too high in November for us to leave anything to chance. I believe from the testimony we received today that there are a number of steps that both entities will be taking in order to secure the vote. The legislature also has a role in this to make any requisite statutory changes. But I'd encourage everyone who is physically able, please take advantage of early vote.
Do you expect to pass a law that would take effect and help safeguard a robust and accurate vote in November?
There were a number of proposals put to us today by the State Board of Elections, by the New York City Board of Elections, even recommendations from the United States Postal Service. I will note that they didn't show up to testify. They declined to do so, but submitted testimony late last night in which they made some recommendations for the legislature. And so all of those things are going to be considered. I think that the legislative body has a responsibility to instill confidence. And so if we have a role to play in that, we will do so. But I also believe that the boards of elections and the United States Postal Service will come together and will make it work. We just have to be on top of them.
Was any role in the confusion and the problems that we saw after the primaries, was any of that contributed to or caused in any significant way by the governor's decision to mail out applications for absentee ballots, which is something we had not seen before?
Certainly. This is, again, an unprecedented executive order made during unprecedented times. And many of us were satisfied with giving each voter the opportunity to utilize this absentee option. The problem was that in 2016, there were only about 115,000 absentee applications sent out. In this June primary, there were 1.7 million. So you're seeing an increase of almost tenfold. There is going to be problems. And so I'm hoping that with the orders of magnitude set to be significantly higher in November as it pertains to absentee applications and the mailing of the ballots, that the Board of Elections can begin to do that preparation now so that we won't be overwhelmed in November.
Okay, in our last 30 seconds before I let you go, not far from where you are sitting in your district office is one of the COVID-only hospitals downstate that was really swamped, overwhelmed, really hard hit, a lot of loss of life there. Are things better now?
So they have made the transition at SUNY Downstate back into the services they were providing pre-COVID, but there's still much uncertainty. We know that during the pandemic, the state put through budget cuts that affected SUNY Downstate, as well as Kings County Hospital right across the street. There's still uncertainty about whether those cuts will be restored, what aid we will get from the federal government, and how the state will react to whatever aid comes down. And so I have been a huge proponent of us not taking away resources from a hospital in one of the epicenters of the epicenter, and I will continue that advocacy because our people died at disproportionate rates, and we can't double down on that death by making budgetary cuts.
Okay. Thanks so much for your work on that, and especially on the elections as well. Thanks for joining us, Senator. We're going to take a short break here. More than 30 years after a black teenager was killed by a group of gangsters in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, his life and the aftermath of his murder are being revisited in a documentary that is set to air on HBO. You'll meet the director of that film after this short break. Stay with us.